Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. So glad you could be here today. Today we're going to be reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, chapters 9 and 10, and we'll be getting to that in just a second. I also want to mention just really briefly, we have our update here for the last two chapters. Of course, our heroes have uh, found themselves. Well, okay. So here's what we have. We have a a thing that they don't know what it is attacking ships and disabling them and sinking them, and then all of a sudden it seems to happen all over the world. It seems to happen sometimes, much too far away for there to be, just one of these. So they're thinking, there's some sort of beast, some sort of monster that is um, destroying these vessels, and of course, every ship that goes missing is now suddenly a victim of this terrible beast. And um, our hero, Professor of Marine Biology, Pierre Aronnax, has been asked to go on a voyage on a American naval vessel called the Abraham Lincoln, and he and his manservant Conseil uh, agree to go to kind of find a way to um, hopefully stop this beast, which he believes to be a giant narwhal, because of the large, sharp, pointed object that is evidenced by the holes in the pierced hulls of these damaged ships. And there he meets Ned Land, who is a described as a Canadian a lot. I'm not sure why that's so important, but he's also a master harpooner. So he is the one who is expected to harpoon this vicious giant narwhal, and hopefully uh, lead the attack and stop this beast from destroying other ships. So we see our heroes for months traveling around in the Abraham Lincoln. They go to the Pacific, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. They are following where it used to be, and then just as they're about to give up, they find the creature, and they can't really make it out. It doesn't really. All they know is it glows underwater, and it's often in the horizon. They chase it, but it's always faster than they are, so they can never catch up to it. And then when they find out that when it really wants to, it can go out much faster than any of the American naval ships. So this goes on for a while. They play a little chase game, and then what finally happens is the beast uh, attacks the Abraham Lincoln and rams into it, basically attacks it by coming up under the water and hitting it, and Pierre Aronnax is thrown overboard into the ocean. And at that point, Conseil, ever faithful, jumps in after him, and they are floating on the in the ocean for quite some time until they come across a voice, as they hear a voice in the distance, and there, on top of something that is in the water, is the harpooner Ned Land. So the three of them all kind of climb up onto this thing, which they don't know really what it is, and they realize that the thing that they had been chasing all this time was in fact a submarine. So this is a man-made thing and not a giant narwhal. Um, they are taken inside the ship. Eventually, they have to knock on the metal plates. They can see the metal plates and the bolts and everything, and they have to knock on it because the submarine is about to submerge. And once they do that, it comes back up again, and these sailors in very odd clothing come out. They bring them into the submarine and place them in a room. They are visited by a very tall, very stately man and one of his sailors, and they explain their story to him, then what happened, and they do it in English and French and German and Latin, and they get no response either from either of the two who are listening to them. Eventually, they are given food, and they, having finally got a chance to rest and eat, they fall asleep. And that's where we're at right now. That was the conclusion of our last chapter. And so now we are into chapter 9. If you are ready. Chapter 9 is entitled Nedlands Temper. I have no idea how long we slept, but it must have been a long time, for afterward we felt completely rested. I woke up first. My companions had not yet moved, and we were still stretched out in their corners like inert objects. I had scarcely gotten up from this somewhat hard bed when I felt my mind clearing, my brain returning to normal. So I once again began carefully examining our cell. Nothing had been changed in the cabin itself. The prison was still a prison, and the prisoners still prisoners. The steward, however, had cleared off the table while we were asleep. There was, therefore, nothing to indicate that our situation would change in the near future, and in all seriousness, I asked myself if we were destined to live indefinitely in this cage. This thought seemed all the more painful, for although my mind was free from the obsessions of the day before, I felt as if there was a weight on my chest. I found it difficult to breathe. The air felt heavy and insufficient for my lungs. Even though our cell was enormous, it was obvious that we had used up a large part of the oxygen it contained. For it is a known fact that in 1 hour a man uses up the oxygen contained in 3.5 cubic feet of air, and that this air, which then holds an almost equal quantity of carbon dioxide, becomes unbreathable. It was therefore urgent that the air in our prison be renewed, along with, undoubtedly, all the air in the submarine. This gave rise to a question in my mind. How did the commander of the submarine solve this problem? Did he obtain his air chemically, releasing the oxygen contained in potassium chlorate by means of heat, or absorbing the carbon dioxide with potassium lye? In this case, he must have kept up some contact with dry land in order to get chemicals needed for this operation. Or did he merely store air under pressure in reservoirs and then feed it out according to the needs of his crew? Perhaps. Or, and this process would be the easiest, cheapest, and therefore most likely, did he merely come to the surface to breathe like whales, and thus replenish his air supply every 24 hours? In any case, whatever method he used, it seemed to me that the time had come to put it into operation without delay. In fact, I was already obliged to speed up my breathing in order to make use of the little oxygen remaining in the room, when, suddenly, I felt refreshed by a current of pure air containing a strong smell of salt. It was sea air, reviving and revivifying, and full of iodine. I opened my mouth wide to allow my lungs to soak it up. At the same time, I felt movement, a slight but undeniable rolling. The steel-plated monster of a ship had evidently come to the surface to breathe, just like a whale. Its method of respiration was, therefore, now a matter of certainty. When my lungs had soaked up enough of this pure air, I tried to find the aeriferous conduit, if you will, which had brought us this life-giving oxygen, and I soon found it. Above the door, there was a ventilating hole through which passed a column of fresh air, thus renewing the impoverished atmosphere of our cell. I had gotten to this point in my investigations when Ned and Conseil woke up almost at the same time, undoubtedly because of the fresh air that had entered the room. They rubbed their eyes, stretched, and were on their feet in an instant. "Did Monsieur sleep well?" Conseil asked with his usual politeness. Very well, thank you, I answered. And you, Ned? Very soundly, Professor. I may be wrong, but it seems to me as if I'm breathing sea air. Sailors don't make mistakes about such things, and I told the Canadian that what had happened while he was asleep. Good, he said. That accounts for the roaring we heard when the so-called narwhal was inside of the Abraham Lincoln. Right, Ned, it was breathing. The only trouble, Monsieur Aronnax, is that I have no idea what time it is, unless maybe it's lunchtime. Lunchtime, Ned? Breakfast time would be more accurate, for I'm sure this is already the following day. That would mean, said Conseil, that we've slept for 24 hours. I think so, I answered. I won't argue with you, retorted Ned Land. Whether it's lunch or breakfast, the steward will be more than welcome, whichever he wants to bring. Perhaps he'll bring both, said Conseil. Fine, replied the Canadian. We have a right to 2 meals, and as for me, I could polish them both off without any trouble at all. In any case, Ned, let's wait, I answered. It's obvious these people don't intend to let us die of starvation, otherwise the last meal wouldn't make any sense. Unless it was just to fatten us up, exclaimed Ned. Come, come, I said. We haven't fallen into the hands of cannibals. One time doesn't make a custom, the Canadian answered seriously. Who knows whether these people haven't gone a long time without fresh meat, and as a result 3 healthy, well-built individuals like the professor, his servant, and myself. Put such ideas out of your mind, Ned, I replied. And above all, don't let such ideas make you lose your temper against our hosts, and thus make our situation that much worse. Anyway, said the harpooner, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse, and I don't see either lunch or breakfast turning up. Ned, I said, we have to conform to the rules on board, and I imagine our appetites are running faster than the cook's watch. Well, then we'll have to set ours by his, said Conseil calmly. That's you all over, Conseil, my friend, retorted the impatient Canadian. You never get riled up, always calm. You'll be capable of thanking God before saying grace, and then dying of starvation rather than complaining. What good would it do? Complaining doesn't have to do any good. It's enough all by itself. And if these pirates, and I say pirates out of respect to the professor, and so as not to annoy him, since he won't allow me to call them cannibals, if these pirates think they're going to keep me in this stifling cage without hearing me let loose with some of my swearing, they're making a big mistake. Come now, Monsieur Aronnax, tell me frankly, do you think they're going to keep us cooped up for long in this iron box? To tell the truth, Ned, I don't know any more than you. But what would be your guess? My guess is that, quite by chance, we've stumbled on a very important secret. Now, if the crew of the submarine wants to keep this secret, and if this is more important to them than the lives of 3 men, I think our chances of survival are slim. If this is not the case, the monster which has swallowed us up will, at the first opportunity, return us to the world inhabited by our fellow men. Unless they enroll us in the crew, said Conseil, and thus keep us. Until some frigate, interrupted Ned Land, that's faster and more maneuverable than the Abraham Lincoln captures this pirate's den and makes its crew, and us along with it, walk the plank. Perhaps you're right, Ned, I replied. But as far as I know, nobody has yet made us any propositions along this line, so it's useless discussing what we should do in such and such a situation. I repeat, let's wait and see what happens, and in the meanwhile we'll sit still, for there's nothing we can do anyway. No, Professor, replied the harpooner, refusing to give up. We have to do something. Do what, Ned? Escape! Escaping from prisons on land is difficult enough, but from an underwater prison, it would seem to me completely out of the question. All right, Ned, asked Conseil. What do you have to say to that? I can't imagine an American ever at a loss for something to say. The harpooner, visibly embarrassed, remained silent. Under the conditions in which fate had placed us, escape was absolutely impossible. But a Canadian is partly a Frenchman, and one could see this clearly in his answer. Well, Monsieur Aronnax, he said after several moments' thought, do you know what people do when there's no way out of a jail? No, Ned. It's simple. They just make sure they stay there. Good for you, cried Conseil. It's better to bring it's better being inside one than above or below it. But only after tossing out the jailers, wardens, and guards, added Ned Land. What, Ned? You're thinking seriously of taking over this ship? Very seriously, answered the Canadian. But that would be impossible. Why, Professor? If we get the opportunity, I don't see why we shouldn't take advantage of it. If there are only about 20 men on board this ship, that shouldn't frighten two Frenchmen and a Canadian, should it? It was best to agree with the harpooner rather than start another discussion. So I only answered, let's see what happens, Ned, and then decide. But until such time, please try and be a little more patient. Our only chance lies in some kind of ruse. And if you keep losing your temper, we'll never have the slightest chance of fooling them. So promise me you'll try to accept our situation without getting so angry. I promise, Professor, replied Ned in a not too reassuring tone. I won't do or say a thing to show them how I feel, even when meals aren't served up as regularly as we'd like. So I have your word of honor, Ned, I answered the Canadian. Then the conversation stopped, and each one of us became lost in his own thoughts. I must admit that, as far as I was concerned, in spite of the harpooner's confidence, I held out little hope. I could not see where we would get the opportunity Ned Land mentioned. In order to be operated as it was, this submarine needed a large crew, and this meant that if we had to fight it out, we would be too strongly outnumbered. Moreover, first of all, we had to be free, and we weren't. I could see no means of escaping from a cell so hermetically sealed as the one we were in. And whatever secrets the strange captain of this ship wanted to keep, and this was undoubtedly the case, he would never let us wander about freely on board. Now, would he get rid of us by some violent means, or would he just let us off on some bit of land? That was what we didn't know. Either of these theories seemed plausible, and one had to be a harpooner to entertain ideas of gaining our freedom by force. Moreover, I realized that Ned Land was becoming more and more embittered as he brooded over his situation. I began to hear him mumbling swear words, and his gestures once again became menacing. He would get up, pace about like a wild animal in a cage, and strike the wall with his fists and feet. Besides, after such a long wait, we were beginning to feel violent pangs of hunger, and this time the steward did not appear. And for people with good intentions, the crew seemed to be taking a very long time supplying our needs. Ned Land, tormented by the gnawing sensation in his stomach, was getting more and more worked up, and in spite of having given me his word, I was afraid he might not be able to restrain himself if some member of the crew came in. For 2 more hours, Ned Land's temper got worse and worse. He shouted and yelled, but all in vain. The steel-plated walls were deaf. I could not even hear any noise inside the boat. It seemed dead. It wasn't moving, for I would obviously have felt it vibrate beneath the pulse of the propeller. It was undoubtedly lying deep in the ocean, and no longer belonged to life on Earth. All this dreary silence was frightening. As for our being abandoned and isolated in our cell, I had no idea how long it would last. The hopes I had felt after our interview with the captain were slowly vanishing. His gentle look, generous face, and noble bearing were all beginning to disappear from my memory. I now saw this mysterious person as he really must have been, pitiless and cruel. I saw him as being a stranger to all human feelings, inaccessible to emotions of pity, and the implacable enemy of his fellow men, toward whom he had sworn an everlasting hatred. But was this man going to let us die of starvation, locked up in this narrow prison, exposed to these horrible temptations brought on by fierce hunger? This awful thought took a hold of my mind and imagination, and I felt myself overcome by a terrible feeling of horror. Conseil remained calm. Ned Land was roaring. Just then we heard a noise outside. There was a sound of footsteps on the metal floor. Bolts were pulled, the door opened, and the steward appeared. Before I could do anything to stop him, the Canadian rushed at the poor man and knocked him over, clutching his throat. The steward was choking in his powerful grip. Conseil was trying to loosen the harpooner's hands, and from his half-unconscious victim, I was about to help him, when suddenly I was nailed to the spot by the following words spoken in French. "Calm down, Mr. Land, and you, Professor. Please listen to me." That's the end of chapter 9. Who is it that's speaking? Let's find out. In chapter 10, entitled The Man of the Seas. It was the captain who had spoken. At these words, Ned Land quickly got up. At a sign from his master, the steward, nearly strangled, left reeling, but such was the captain's power over his crew that this man did not give a single sign of the resentment he must have felt against the Canadian. Conseil, curious in spite of himself, and I, stunned by what had happened, waited in silence for the outcome of this scene. The captain leaned against the corner of the table, crossed his arms, and looked at us intently. Why did he hesitate? Did he regret having spoken in French? Perhaps. After several moments' silence, which none of us dreamed of interrupting, he said, in a calm, penetrating voice, "Gentlemen, I also speak French, English, German, and Latin. I could therefore have answered you at our first meeting, but I wanted to get to know you first, and then think the matter over. Your 4 versions, almost exactly the same, made me certain of your identities. I know now that fate has put me in the presence of Monsieur Pierre Aronnax, professor of natural history at the Paris Museum, and lately entrusted with a scientific mission abroad. Conseil, his servant, and Ned Land, of Canadian origin, harpooner on board the frigate Abraham Lincoln of the United States Navy." I nodded in agreement. The captain's words were not a question, but a statement, and no answer was therefore expected. This man expressed himself with complete ease and without accent. His sentences were correct, his words well chosen, and his fluency remarkable. And yet I did not feel him to be a compatriot. He then continued, "You have undoubtedly felt, monsieur, that I took too long to make my second visit. It was because once I knew who you were, I wanted to consider carefully what to do with you. For a long time I could not make up my mind. It was most unfortunate that circumstances have put you in the presence of a man who has broken all ties with humanity. You came and disturbed my life. Involuntarily, I said. Involuntarily? The stranger answered, raising his voice a bit. Was the Abraham Lincoln involuntarily hunting me throughout the ocean? Did you take passage aboard that ship involuntarily? Did your shells bounce involuntarily off the hull of my submarine? Did Ned Land's harpoon strike me involuntarily? I felt as if there were pent-up anger in these words, but I had a completely logical answer to his accusations, and I gave it. Monsieur, I said, you undoubtedly have no idea of the discussions you have provoked in America and Europe. You don't know how much the various accidents produced by collisions with your submarine have stirred up public opinion in both continents. I won't bore you with the innumerable theories which have been put forward to try and explain the unexplainable phenomenon to which only you had the secret. But you must understand that in pursuing you throughout the Pacific, the Abraham Lincoln thought it was hunting some powerful sea monster, which must at all costs be cleared from the ocean. A half smile played about the captain's lips, and then, in a calmer voice, he said, Monsieur Aronnax, would you dare state that your frigate would not have pursued and shot at a submarine as well as a monster? This question embarrassed me, for Commander Farragut would certainly not have felt a moment's hesitation. He would have thought it his duty to destroy a ship of this kind just as well as a giant narwhal. You can therefore understand, monsieur, the stranger went on, why I have the right to treat you as enemies. I didn't answer, and with good reason. What use are the best arguments when they can be destroyed by force? I have given the matter considerable thought, the captain went on. Nothing forced me to show you any hospitality. If I were forced to leave you, I wouldn't have the slightest interest in seeing you again. I would just put you on the ship's platform on which you took refuge, dive down beneath the surface, and then forget that you ever existed. Wouldn't I be within my rights? Within the rights, perhaps, of a savage, I replied, but not those of a civilized man. Professor, I am not what you would call a civilized man. I've broken with all of society for reasons which I alone can appreciate. I therefore don't obey its rules, and I advise you never to refer to them again in front of me. This was said in no uncertain terms. A flash of anger and disdain had lit up his eyes, and I felt this must be a man with a terrible past. Not only had he put himself outside the realm of human law, but he had made himself independent and free in the strictest sense of the word, and placed himself beyond the reach of such laws. Who would dare pursue him into the ocean depths, when, even on the surface, he could defy all attempts to harm his ship? What boat could withstand the impact of this underwater monitor? What armored ship, no matter how thick its hull, could resist a blow of its lance? No man could ask him to account for his actions. God, if he believed in him, and his conscience, if he had one, were the only judges to whom he was answerable. While these thoughts crossed my mind in rapid succession, this strange person was silent, absorbed, and as if wrapped up in himself. I looked at him with mixed feelings of horror and curiosity, just as Oedipus undoubtedly looked at the Sphinx. After a long silence, the captain once again started speaking. So for a long time I could not make up my mind, he said. But finally I thought that my own interests would be reconciled with the natural sense of pity found in every man. Since fate has put you here, you will remain on board. You will be free, And in exchange for this liberty, I shall impose on you only one condition. If you give me your word that you will accept it, that will be enough. Go on, monsieur, I replied. I imagine your condition will be acceptable to a man of honor. Yes, monsieur, and here it is. It is quite possible that certain unforeseen events might oblige me to order you to stay in your cabins for several hours or days, depending on the situation. Since I prefer never to use force, I will expect from you under such circumstances more than any other total obedience. In this way, I will clear you of any responsibility, for I will be the one who has made it impossible for you to see what you should not see. Do you accept this condition? This meant that strange things happened on board, things that shouldn't be seen by people who had not put themselves outside the law. Of all the surprises the future had held in store for me, this proved to be the least. We accept, I answered. Only, with your permission, monsieur, I would like to ask one question. Only one. Go ahead. You said we were free on board. Completely. I would like to know, then, what this freedom involves. The freedom to walk about, to look, even to examine everything that goes on here, except in some rare circumstances. In short, the same freedom enjoyed by all of us on board. It was obvious we didn't understand each other. Excuse me, monsieur, I replied, but this freedom is no more than that of a prisoner who is allowed to move around in his cell. That isn't enough for us. It will have to do. What? We have to give up forever the idea of seeing our country, our friends, and our families? Yes, monsieur, but giving up the insupportable yoke of life on earth, which men mistake for liberty, will perhaps not be so unpleasant as you imagine. Well, one thing's certain, cried Ned Land. I'll never give my word not to try and escape. I'm not asking for your word on that score, Master Land, the captain answered coldly. Monsieur, I said, becoming angry in spite of myself, you're taking advantage of our situation. This is cruelty. No, monsieur, it is kindness. You are my prisoners of war. I am keeping you, when at a word I could have you plunged into the ocean depths. You asked me. You have come upon a secret which no man in the world was to know, the secret of my existence. And you think I'm going to send you back to that world, which must know me no more? Never. By keeping you, it's not you that I'm guarding, but myself. These words showed clearly that the captain's mind was made up, and that no arguments would be of any use against him. So, I said, you're quite simply letting us choose between life and death. That's right. My friends, I said, when the problem's put like this, we have no choice, but we've made no promises to the captain of this ship. None, monsieur, replied the stranger. Then, in a gentler tone, he continued, Now, please, permit me to finish what I wanted to tell you. I know you, Monsieur Aronnax. You, if not your companions, will find that the stroke of fate which brought you here, will not give you much cause for complaint. Among my favorite books for studying, you'll find your own work on the great ocean depths. I have often read it. You have carried your knowledge as far as earthbound science will permit. But you don't know everything. You haven't seen everything. Therefore, let me tell you, Professor, that you won't regret the time spent on board my ship. You will travel through a land of marvels. Your mind will be in a continual state of astonishment and stupefaction. It will be difficult for you to get bored with the continual spectacle that will pass before your eyes. I'm starting out on another underwater trip around the world. Who knows? Perhaps my last. And once more I shall see everything I have been able to study beneath these seas, through which I have traveled so many times. And you will accompany me in my studies. Starting today, you will enter a new element, and you will see what no man has yet seen. For I and my crew don't count any more, and thanks to me, you will be able to penetrate the last secrets of our planet. I cannot deny that these words had a great effect on me, and he hit me in my weakest spot, and for a moment I forgot that contemplating sublime things is never worth losing one's freedom. But I trusted to the future to solve this problem. I therefore merely answered, Monsieur, though you have broken with humanity, I would like to think that you have not abandoned all humanitarian feelings. We are castaways who have been charitably taken aboard your ship, and we won't forget it. And, as for me, I won't deny that if my interest in science could ever be greater than my desire for freedom, this promised voyage would offer me a great compensations. I thought the captain was going to stretch out his hand to seal our bargain, but he didn't. I felt sorry for him. One last question, I said, just as this mysterious person seemed about to withdraw. Go ahead, Professor. By what name should I address you? Monsieur, he answered. For you, I shall be merely Captain Nemo, and you and your companions will be, for me, merely passengers on the Nautilus. Captain Nemo called out. A steward appeared. The captain gave him orders in that strange language I could not recognize. Then, turning to the Canadian and Conseil, he said, A meal is waiting for you in your cabin. Please follow this man. You won't catch me refusing, answered the harpooner. Conseil and he finally left the cell in which they had been locked up for more than 30 hours. And now, Monsieur Aronnax, our lunch is ready. Allow me to go first. At your orders, Captain. I followed Captain Nemo, and after crossing the threshold of our cell, I went down a sort of electrically lit corridor, similar to the gangways on ordinary ships. After walking 30 or so feet, a second door opened in front of us. We then entered an austerely decorated dining room. At each end of this room stood two high oak sideboards inlaid with ebony. On their shelves lay china, porcelain, and glass of incalculable value, and also a silver dinner service sparkling beneath the lights set in the painted ceiling. In the center of the room was a richly set table. Captain Nemo pointed out the seat I was to occupy. Sit down. You must be dying of hunger. The lunch consisted of a variety of dishes supplied from the ocean and several others unknown to me. These last were very good, and I quickly became accustomed to their peculiar flavor. They seemed rich in phosphorus, and I thought they too must come from the sea. Captain Nemo looked at me, even though I said nothing. He guessed what I was thinking and answered the questions I was dying to ask. Although most of this food might be unknown to you, he said, you can eat it without worrying. It's both healthy and nourishing. For a long time now, I've given up ordinary land food, and I'm none the worse for it, and my crew, who are all fit and strong, eat no differently than I do. Does that mean, I said, that all these dishes come from the sea? Yes, Professor, the sea furnishes me with everything I need. Sometimes I drag nets behind the ship and haul them in when they're full to the bursting point, or sometimes I go out hunting in this element, which seems inaccessible to men, and stalk the game that lives in underwater forests. And my flocks, like those of Neptune's old shepherd, graze without fear over the immense prairies of the ocean. I have their vast properties which I alone exploit, and which are continually sown with all kinds of crops by the Creator's hand. I looked at Captain Nemo somewhat astonished, and replied, I can perfectly understand, monsieur, that your nets furnish your table with excellent fish. I understand less well, how you hunt aquatic game in your underwater forests. But I don't understand at all how a slice of meat, no matter how small, could be included on your menu. In spite of which, replied Captain Nemo, I never eat the flesh of land animals. But then, what is this? I asked, pointing to a plate on which remained several slices of steak. What you think is meat, Professor, is nothing but sea turtle steak. Here also are some dolphin livers, which you would think were stewed pork. I have an excellent cook whose specialty is preparing seafood. Take a taste of all these dishes. Here are sea cucumbers, which we put up in jars, and which a Malayan would declare unrivaled in the whole world. Here is cream made from whale's milk, and sugar extracted from rockweed in the North Sea. And lastly, permit me to offer you anemone jam, which is as good as that made from the most delicious fruit. I tasted all these things more out of curiosity than as a connoisseur, while Captain Nemo regaled me with his unlikely stories. But the ocean, Monsieur Aronnax, that prodigious and inexhaustible provider, does not only nourish me, it also clothes me. The cloth you are now wearing was made from the filaments of certain shellfish. It was colored with the same purple dye used by ancient Greeks and Romans, and then tinted with some violet shades I extracted from Mediterranean sea hares. The perfumes you will find on the shelf in your bathroom are produced by distilling certain marine plants. Your bed is made of the softest eel grass. The pen you will use is made out of whalebone, and your ink is the secretion of the cuttlefish. I receive everything from the sea, just as one day all will return to it. You love the sea, don't you, Captain? Yes, I love it. The sea is everything. It covers 7/10 of the globe. Its breath is pure and healthy. It is an immense desert where a man is never alone, for he can feel life quivering all about him. The sea is only a receptacle for all the prodigious supernatural things that exist inside it. It is only movement and love. It is the living infinite, as one of your poets has said, and, in fact, Professor, it contains the three kingdoms of nature, mineral, vegetable, and animal. This last is well represented by the four groups of zoophytes, by the three classes of articulata, and by the 5 classes of mollusks, and by 3 classes of vertebrates, mammals, and reptiles, and those innumerable legions of fish, that infinite order of animals which includes more than 13,000 species, only 1/10 of which live in fresh water. The sea is a vast reservoir of nature. The world, so to speak, began with the sea, and who knows but that it will also end in the sea. There lies supreme tranquility. The sea does not belong to tyrants. On its surface they can still exercise their iniquitous rights, fighting, destroying one another, and indulging in their other earthly horrors. But 30 feet below its surface their power ceases, their influence dies out, and their dominion disappears. Ah, monsieur, one must live within the ocean. Only there can one be independent. Only there do I have no master. There I am free. Captain Nemo suddenly fell silent in the midst of this burst of enthusiasm. He had let himself be carried away beyond the bounds of his usual reserve. Or had he let himself be carried away? Uh, had he said too much? For several moments he paced up and down, seeming very disturbed. Then his nerves calmed down. His face took on its usual cold expression, and turning toward me, he said, "Now, Professor, if you would like to look over the Nautilus, I am at your disposal." And that, my friends, is the end of Chapter 10 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. We are once again left on one of those exciting cliffhangers that makes us want to pick up the book and read it next time, which we will on Friday at 4 p.m. I hope you can join me as we'll read chapters 11 and 12, and we'll see what new adventures our heroes can get into. Thank you very much for joining me. Hopefully we'll see you on Friday, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, folks.